What if I told you that this is one of the most important foods in the 18th century? Yes, this lowly potato begins to be very, very important to multiple cultures in the 18th century. Of course, it was important before that in other parts of the world, but in Europe, in the 18th century, the popularity of this explodes. Potatoes were grown for thousands of years in the area of the Andes Mountains around Peru and southern Colombia. They were an important part of the food source of the people that lived there in that time. The potatoes in that time period were multiple colors, they were small. Today, they would look like not much to us, but they were very important to the survival of those people at that time. In Europe, no one knew about the potato until they were written about by the Spanish conquerors of the early 16th century. So the Spanish were in that area in, say, the 1530s. And they're marching through this area, and some of the soldiers were writing about this, or at least they saw these little potatoes being used by the populace, how they were survived upon, how they cooked them in the time period. Not much was done about this. It isn't until the 1550s that some of these soldiers write about their experiences 20 years earlier, and they explain to us about how those people were living and what the food sources they were living upon. And they talked about these potatoes. They had two kinds of potatoes in South America at the time: the sweet potato and the white potato, or at least as we call them, white potatoes. These potatoes didn't end up in Spain right away. In fact, we don't really hear about them until, say, the 1570s, 20 years after they were written about. And the first references we have to these potatoes are in the Canary Islands in the 1570s, and just a little bit after that, we get some references to a hospital, a monastery hospital, ordering some potatoes to use for their invalids in that location. So obviously, people knew about these potatoes in the 1570s and probably had been eating them, maybe even a little bit earlier, but we don't have very many records for that. So the potatoes get introduced in the 1570s, and by the 1580s or 1590s, because of the connection between Spain and Ireland at the time, potatoes are introduced into Ireland. From the time of introduction into Ireland, 50 years later, potatoes have become one of the most important food sources for all the poor people in Ireland. It becomes so important that basically they couldn't survive without them. There is a civil war at the time, and the potato was one of the reasons why so many people could survive that civil war. It was a kind of a slash and burn civil war, but if your potatoes are growing underground, some invading army can come through and trash everything, and still your food source is hiding there under the ground. In the research, there's an astounding number that comes up. In fact, you read this number and you say, no way. Every person I've talked to about this, I say this little part and they're like, John, no, that isn't real. You shouldn't put it in the video. The hardworking laborers, the poor working in Ireland in the late 17th century, probably in the 18th century too, were eating as many as 10 to 15 pounds of potatoes a day. If I tried to eat 10 pounds of potatoes in a day, I would explode. I probably wouldn't survive the experience. We could do a video like that, but I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to eat 10 pounds of potatoes in a day. But that is how important it was. It was 85 to 90% of the diet of the working poor in Ireland in that time period. They would eat them in the simplest ways possible. Boil them, mix whatever you have, like milk or butter with them a little bit, maybe some salt, maybe some pepper. If you can't afford that, it doesn't matter. You can just eat the boiled potatoes. And that is exactly what they did, morning, noon, and night. There's a great little cookbook from the 18th century that helps us understand the potato cookery of this time period. And it talks about how lots of different people are cooking potatoes and all the different kinds of ways we can use potatoes. In fact, for this cookbook that's specifically meant for poor people, potatoes take up multiple pages. So potatoes are really important in this time period. And it starts off with talking about how the Irish are surviving on potatoes and how they eat them. It says the Irish have several ways of eating them. The poorer sort eat them with salt only after they are boiled, others with butter and salt, but most with milk and sugar. Let's make some potatoes the way the Irish were making them. This is going to be so simple. I'm gonna peel some of these nice big potatoes. We're gonna slice them up into chunks and then boil them until they're just the right tenderness. A little bit of salt, and I might even try them with the milk and sugar. You can't get any more simple than the way those poor Irish laborers were eating their potatoes. A little bit of salt, that's it. And there's absolutely nothing to complain about, really. So good. Let's see what happens when we shake a little bit of sugar and a little bit of milk on this. Amazingly, it already smells better. Not that it smelled bad at all, but you know, I don't know that I've ever had potatoes with sugar on it. But I might in the future. Now, of course, we're all familiar with mashed potatoes, and mashed potatoes show up in the 18th century cookery, and they show up in this primitive cookery cookbook. In fact, two different kinds of mashed potatoes. The classic one that we're going to be doing here, which is called Another Way, is to mash potatoes and then put them into bacon or pork broth with spice and pepper and sweet herbs, which is something like pea soup. But then he gives us the normal way that we would expect. Another way is to mash potatoes very fine, then take some sweet herbs dried and beaten small with spice, butter, and salt mixed all together. This is an excellent pudding to put into the bellies of rabbits, hare, or fish when roasted. So he's giving us a couple of different ways we can use it, but this is the classic mashed potatoes. We're gonna mash these up nice and fine. And when they are mashed up, I'm gonna add a little bit of butter while it's still warm enough for it to melt. And then we're gonna add some of our spice, specifically the classic spice of the 18th century, a little bit of nutmeg, along with some pepper and some salt, a little bit of parsley. I'm gonna mix this all up. Let's serve it in the dish and just add a little parsley to the top for garnish. Let's give these potatoes that are made right out of the 18th century cookbook a quick taste. Again, so good, so excellent. Almost exactly the way we would make them today, but we can see that they have their roots in almost 250 years ago. The English knew about the potato in that 17th century context. They had writings about them, and maybe they had potatoes in botanical gardens, but they didn't become popular as a food source at all. They were rejected as a food source, probably rejected because the Irish were surviving upon them, and they said, that's food for really, really poor people. Why would we be eating the potato? But there's an important thing that happens here in the 17th and 18th century. The Irish become a very important cheap labor source for England. So Irish itinerant workers would come over from Ireland for months at a time. They would be field workers in England, probably southern England especially. They would bring potatoes with them in their pockets. And the farmers there that are using them as labor would put them up in very, very cheap housing, undoubtedly, and they would give them a tiny plot of land to grow their own food. And so the Irish workers would plant potatoes. And the English farmers noticed how prolific these potato plants were. How these very, very poor workers were able to survive on the food they grew in a tiny plot of land. And so the potatoes started to become much more popular in England just because these farmers saw what was happening with the potatoes and understood how important a food source they could be, especially to other poor people in England. That grows potatoes in England. That also is a very similar connection with how these potatoes begin to be popular in North America. North America had different waves of people immigrating from Europe. Waves in the 1640s, waves in the 1620s, and later than that. It isn't until the early 18th century, say 1720, that the Scots-Irish start to come to North America. And they bring the potato with them, and that's the birth of potatoes being popular in North America. We love potatoes today, and it's all because the Scots-Irish brought them with them. We can use potatoes in so many different ways, and they certainly did in the 18th century. And one of the ways that becomes important, especially when there were wheat shortages, was to make potato bread. How do we stretch out the wheat to make, say, twice as much bread as before? We can use potatoes, and he mentions this recipe here in Primitive Cookery. To make potato bread, take as much boiled pulp of potatoes as wheaten flour, knead them together as common dough is done for bread. So we are going to make a very simple potato bread. This is so easy, anyone can do it. The recipe calls for 50-50 mashed potatoes and flour. You can use any flour. You can use regular bread flour, but standard all-purpose flour will work just as well. In fact, that is very close to the kind of flour that they would have had in the 18th century. Something that didn't have a tremendous quantity of gluten like a lot of today's bread flours do. We're just going to mix this up together with the other two classic ingredients for bread. 18th century bread includes flour, water, salt, and yeast. We're just going to basically mix this. We're going to add a little bit of water. Actually, we don't need to add a tremendous quantity because the yeast from the 18th century is liquid yeast, so it already has water in it. Let's knead these together. Set this dough to rise in a nice warm place for about an hour. After it is risen, we can gently place it in the oven and bake it for probably about 45 minutes at 400 degrees. This potato bread turned out tremendous. Let's give it a really quick taste. You can see it looks good. It's got a great crumb to it and just wonderful crust and beautiful interior. And this was such a great combination. I'm surprised that basically every loaf of bread doesn't have this much potato in it because the taste is good. It's got better texture. It is really one of the best ways to bake bread, and it is very simple to do. I mean, you can just use leftover mashed potatoes if you want. Toss it in, make a quick loaf. We've got another recipe right next to the potato bread recipe. It says, potatoes boiled, pulped, mixed with milk and salt into a dough, make good cakes. And that's exactly what we've done here. Again, very, very simple recipe. I added a little bit of flour into these, but basically mashed potatoes, a little bit of milk. We make them into a little cake and bake them or fry them in a pan. There's so many different ways we can use these potatoes. This lowly vegetable was so very, very important in the 17th century and in the 18th century to survival for many, many people, mostly poor people, whether they're Irish or whether they're poor people in England or North America. The potato is how people live. And it didn't just show up on poor people's tables. We have plenty of recipes from the time period for rich people's cooking. Even in 17th century English cookery, there are a few potato recipes that show up in the cookbooks, but they're almost like desserts. So it's very interesting. Such a versatile food, and so very important to so many people in history.